people to ask me what Brown was really trying to do with this landscape. Was it just a matter of making pretty curves and shape and things within it to while away an afternoon or something or other? No, he wasn't. What he was trying to do here was to recapture a medieval England, a medieval setting for a medieval building. And this is really the 18th century vision of what the Middle Ages were like. The order and calm represented by the church, well-cultivated fields all around, and a smiling and happy people. And in this context, heaven knows, I don't think Brown actually was responsible for the decision to move Middleton. I think Lord Damer was. Nonetheless, the removal of Middleton away from the church and the creation of Milton Abbey enabled the church to have once again its monastic, the sense of peace and seclusion and being removed from the commercial world, if you like. And that's the image we have today, still 200 years later, must be 250 years later maybe. A fantastic survival in the middle of Dorset. This is St Catherine's Chapel, the oldest religious building on the site, and it was because the chapel was put up by King Athelstan, or was put up to celebrate his victory in battle, or alternatively as an act of penance towards a brother he'd killed. Kings do that kind of thing. And as a result of the chapel that the monastery was built, as a result of the monastery that the town of Middleton was built. And so the chapel can be said to be the origin and the spiritual heart of the whole landscape. In the days of the monastery, there must have been links between the church and the monastery and the chapel. These were broken by a road put through by Damer in the 1750s, and you can't see the road from here because the grass steps immediately behind me go over the road in an arch. The road is completely hidden. And by that means, the connection was maintained between the chapel and the house. When the arch was built, originally we don't know, it could have been by Brown, but if so, it was certainly rebuilt by Hambro in the 19th century. So we're now on the south side of Milton Abbey. And the monastery was founded in the Middle Ages, and it was founded at the confluence of two valleys, the Hilton Valley out to the west and the Delcombe Valley, the enormous Delcombe Valley that runs up to Bulbarrow Hill out to the north. And you have to imagine a landscape which is full of old roads, drove roads getting down to the coast, and sheep pastures and wild woods. And because it was at the confluence of two valleys and this old road system, quite a large town developed on the south side of the church. It ran pretty well up to the church, and it ran away, getting on for half a mile, I guess, away to the south. It was a substantial town with a lot of houses, roads, and we have maps of the town. And if you look at it now, it's gone. But there's one house that was left, Greenwalk Cottage. But to return to the story of the town, it had survived and flourished during the monastic era. It continued when the Tregonwells owned the house after the dissolution of the monasteries. But Lord Damer took against it, and it's hard to say when or why. It's said that he hated the schoolboys scrumping his apples, coming over the wall from the school and scrumping his apples from his orchard, which was, well, it's that flat piece of ground just behind us is where the apples were. And in the 1770s, Lord Damer decided that he was going to get rid of this town, this substantial town, a huge effort. And it may be that even then he formulated the idea of having an enormous lake, so that the lake would run right up to the slope on which the Abbey Church sits. But that's slightly getting ahead of Capability Brown's story. That's from the second phase of his works in the 1770s. In the 1760s, Brown had already taken measures to defend the Abbey Church, the great house, from the town by planting a walk, an evergreen walk, known as Lady Milton's Walk, which was a screen from the town at one side, and on the other side it provided an ornamental walk which ran up to the ruins on the way to Hilton. This is the Hilton Valley out to the west of the house, and I think this valley was Brown's last work at Milton Abbey. And what he did here was radical and different from what he'd been doing the rest of his career, and I think it's never really been fully understood. And the reason why it can't be understood is that if you look behind me, you'll see the village of Hilton, with the church and the houses clustered around it, and it looks just like an ordinary village. You think there must be hundreds of villages like this all over England, and indeed there are. And so it's very difficult to see there as being anything remotely unusual about it. But what's unusual about it is that when Brown started working on this valley, he planted all these woods along the edge, beautifully planted, following, waving in the contour, creating little combes and valleys off it. And the woods go round the back of the village, so the village is included in the landscape. And if you think about conventional views of the way Brown is meant to have done landscapes, you have a house in the middle, you have a great big lawn or park around it, a lake, and then around that you have woods, keeping out all the peasants and the tenantry and the God knows what, so that the gentry have this private kingdom. Here the reverse has happened. And Hilton is completely different from Milton Abbey, the model village on the other side of the estate, because Hilton isn't in any sense a model village. It's got, nowadays we would regard it as a really beautiful village, but it's beautiful because it has so much vernacular building in it. It has cob buildings made of mud and straw and chalk, and it has flint buildings and thatched buildings and so on, all hugger-mugger jammed in together. And it's clear that by the end of his career, Brown was able to see ordinary English villages with nothing special, no barge boarding, no little picturesque details, ordinary English villages, which we have to imagine having pigs wandering round outside and little pytles and yards and closes with the house cow and so on, in ordinary villages themselves as being beautiful. And nowadays, because of Brown, we've come to see this as beautiful without thinking about it. So we think of it as ordinary. But here, at the end of his career, Brown has reached forward outside the landscape and has seen the whole of England as beautiful. That is a radical change. These are the ruins, and they puzzle me. I can't be ashamed by being puzzled by Brown landscapes because we just don't understand a lot of them. But I assume they were built with bits of masonry from the old house that Chambers was replacing. And I'm pretty confident that they were always intended to be a ruin. So they were intended to look much older than they were. If they were built in 1785 or something, they were intended to look much older. And there's evidence for that in these two fantastic yew trees that they were built around. So one of the yew trees actually seems to sit inside the ruin. So the impression it's intended to give is that the yew tree, which could be 1,000 years old, is younger than the ruin. So it's instant aging of the ruin, which is shows chutzpah, I think, at the very least, on the part of the 18th century. The other thing I find really puzzling is that from this area, you can get really good views to the Abbey. It looks really nice. However, the ruin itself is not oriented towards the Abbey. It doesn't face the Abbey. So when you're in the ruin looking out, you can't see the Abbey. You'd have thought if you were building a nice folly, you would face it onto your main house. So when you sat there having tea or something, you would look out and see the lovely view of the house. But this ruin is not like that. It's planted in another direction. And I think what was going on here is that the ruins were built actually as a kind of gateway to a secret garden, which is out to my right and is currently completely overgrown, but it's a long flat piece of ground running back into the hill. And I think this was the pleasure ground. If you think about Milton Abbey today, there's the cedar trees outside the Abbey church. Lady Milton's walks around to here, but there's no real garden as such, no complicated garden. And this, I think, was the secret pleasure ground that the family could come to get away from the bustle of the abbey itself. We've come to the top end of the Delcombe Valley, and it's such a long valley that you can't even see most of it from the house. This northern end, you can see quite clearly how Brown has designed it. It's this wonderful sweep of land running up here, and he laid out a drive right the way along the east side, which is the right-hand side, and we're standing on it now. And along this drive, he created a series of viewpoints, so you know where to go to get the best possible view. And this is his best view for the view north. And the way he's landscaped it, the drive runs up the east side, and you can see these clumps on the east side there. The drive runs through the clumps and round the clumps so that the views are constantly being changed by the trees in the locality. And the views are across to the west side. And the west side, if I take a step back, you'll see the building over there, that was the menagerie. And he punctuated the whole landscape with a series of incidents and diversions. The ruins, the menagerie was another, which was a place for wild animals, actually largely chickens, to be frank, and pheasants. But in theory, all sorts of wild animals would go there. And then at the very head of the Delcombe Valley was the keeper's cottage, another octagonal building. And so on the west side, he brings the woods more or less following the contour. So you have these deep, deep cuttings into the wood, and then the wood is brought straight right, forward and back and forward. And if were you to look at it on a map, you almost need to be in an aeroplane to see it. You'd see these great scrolls of woodland sweeping down on the west side, and the east side, which is like the backdrop of the landscape, is really very plain, with just these clumps to break up the foreground. And that's basically what he's doing here. And you have to remember that in his day, much, but not all of this land, of the valley floor, was grassland for sheep. And the aim was to grow sheep in order to collect their manure to fertilise the arable. Funnily enough, the market had dropped out of wool at the time, and the whole idea of breeding sheep for mutton in particular didn't really take off until Brown was dead. They ate the sheep, obviously, but they weren't actually bred for eating. Milton Abbey, the model village. It has claims to be the first model village built in England, around about 1774. And it was designed, we think the houses were probably designed by Damer's architect Sir William Chambers, and the landscaping, the setting, was done by Brown. And what he did was set the whole street into this serpentine, his favourite shape, with the church more or less at the middle. And in order to do it, to fit it into this coombe, he had to cut away the whole of that side of the hill to fit everything in. But what is interesting about it to me is that this was the village that replaced Middleton, the town. Now, the town was full of freeholders, houses of all sorts of different sizes, odd little streets and gullies, men of some wealth, poverty. It was replaced by this village which has something of the character of a council estate, a whole series of identical houses running down the street. And it was noticed at the time that this was more suited to a servant class than to a village of freeholders. If you like, this is the beginning of the Downton Abbey syndrome of the great estate served by several hundred people. I think for visitors, even in Brown's day, to the Abbey, one of the first places to go would have been to the chapel, with this stunning view down the grass steps, across the Abbey church and down to Mulmots Hill on the far side. It remains breathtaking, I think. Anyone who comes here feels suddenly they've come into this secret, hidden kingdom. To get to Milton, you wind your way down little hawthorn-clad roads, you can hardly see anything, and suddenly you emerge into this unimagined space. And to arrive at the chapel and to look down at the church is one of the great moments of Milton.